Do I have permission to get you to edit the errors out?
Gotta ask him.
All right, so bottom line is I have not to make any errors.
Even that.
Right, okay, this is not good. So if I don't want to be recorded, I have to start speaking now very quickly.
Yes. In 3 minutes you can.
Right. You think I have more than 3 minutes worth to talk about? Okay, well, my time is yours, so that's okay. Can you see the screen? Can you see the screen?
We can see you. That's fine.
That's worse. Would you like a quick lecture on Norwegian poetry while we're waiting?
Уважаемые коллеги, сегодня у нас выступает наш гость из Бристоля, из университета Западной Англии в этом замечательном городе, профессор Ричард Коутс. Ну, если не все вы о нем знаете, ну, во-первых, вы можете посмотреть на его сайте информацию и замечательный куррикулум vitae, но полезно знать, что он, как и все англичане того времени, закончил школу с классическими языками, и поэтому получил образование. Затем он окончил Кембриджский университет, после чего преподавал в университете Суссекса, где был профессором лингвистики в 91-96 годах, а в 98-2003 годах он был деканом факультета когнитивных и компьютерных наук названного университета, после чего и переехал в Бристоль, где он сейчас счастливо трудится. Это я цитирую его собственный CV. Помимо того, для целей нашего сегодняшнего доклада полезно знать, что профессор Коутс является президентом английского топонимического общества English Placement Society, кстати, старейшей такой организации, старейшего общества в Европе, посвященного изучению топонимов, был вице-президентом Международного совета по ономастике, ну и ведущим специалистом по ономастике, одним из ведущих в мире. В центре его исследования, как вы понимаете, находится кельтская филология и взаимоотношения кельтских и римских сторон. У вас есть распечатки, где даны некоторые основные работы профессора Коутса. Сегодняшняя лекция посвящена топонимии Римской Британии. Спасибо за внимание. Ричард?
Thank you. May I start by saying that I apologize for not speaking in Russian because I don't know any Russian. It's better that I don't try. Secondly, thank you very much to Professor Selivanov and the department for inviting me. It's a great honour to be able to speak to you. So, well, that's it really. Thank you for the honour at any rate. Okay, it also gives me an increased sense of importance to have caused so much difficulty before I actually lecture. So with that in mind, I feel duly welcomed, so thank you very much. I'm going to talk about place names in Roman Britain, which is a topic that doesn't move very fast. There is not a great deal of work being done on the place names of Roman Britain. And in fact, as my abstract will tell you, the most recent authoritative survey on the topic of place names in Roman Britain was published by Leo Rive. By the way, his name is not Rivet, but Rive, and Collins, who was an archaeologist, and Colin Smith, who somewhat bizarrely was Professor of Spanish at the University of Cambridge. This book came out in 1979, and it's a measure of how old I ought to feel that this was one of the first books that I reviewed as a junior academic. So in the 40 years that have passed since then, there's been a considerable amount of new work on the body of evidence that Rive and Smith collected. But as you will see, the changes, the advances that have been made, if there are any, are on the basis of very little more evidence. The evidence has barely changed at all, and what we see is changes in the way the evidence has been interpreted. So what I want to do in this lecture, though not necessarily in this order, is to offer an assessment of the sociolinguistic situation in Britain that Rive and Smith's work implies. I want to introduce some newer possibilities that have been suggested for accounting for the place names of Britain as they've been transmitted, some of which are plausible and some of which are less plausible, some of which I'm responsible for, and I won't tell you whether they're the more plausible ones or the less plausible ones. And thirdly, I want to talk about some new interpretations of individual names. I'm not sure how widely the toponymy of Roman Britain is known to my audience, so you have 10 seconds to master the map on the board, which contains the names of places in Roman Britain as established by Rive and Smith, and this is Rive and Smith's map as published in their excellent but now somewhat out of date volume. Okay, I may have time, but probably not, to do some reflection on the survival of Romano-British names into English toponymy. I've put it on the abstract, but I won't necessarily have time to do that. I'll talk about it endlessly if people want me to do so. Okay, so Rive and Smith's book is called The Place Names of Roman Britain. I like a book that tells you what it's about very directly. It was published by Batsford in London in 1979. They include tribal names, that is, the names of peoples who were self-identifying as the inhabitants of Roman Britain. You will not find that the inhabitants of Roman Britain called themselves Britons. Okay, they call themselves by names of lesser entities, some of which we will deal with during the course of the lecture. The book deals very shortly with the history of the study of Romano-British place names. Frankly, there is not a lot to say in that topic because the history is quite thin and has generally been predicated on the study of Welsh place names and on the study of surviving English place names. So Rive and Smith's book is in fact the first major book on Romano-British toponymy, which is why I'm still talking about it 40 years later, because it was also the last one. So it doesn't give me much else to talk about, quite frankly. They deal with two categories of business. The first is to introduce the evidence for place names, and I've listed them there, but I will be talking about them individually during the course of the lecture. And secondly, and what's of greatest interest to most people, quite frankly, who are linguistically oriented rather than classical philologists, is the dictionary of the attested names, an alphabetical dictionary which lists all the sources, classical, post-classical and subclassical, for the mentions of the individual place names. Rive and Smith offer philological explanations in terms of the languages spoken in Britain at the time, about which I shall say more during the lecture again. And we need a little fanfare with the trumpet at this point, the identifications and along with the explanations. We may interpret a particular name as meaning something when it was first given, but where was it? That's the absolute key. And we will discover, in fact, that many place names can be identified. Sorry, many is an exaggeration. There are a number of place names that can be identified I beg your pardon, there are a number of place names that can be explained but not conclusively identified, that is, matched with a place which we know now on the ground. The languages in which the evidence is transmitted is not quite as straightforward as it might appear. The sources are exclusively Latin and Greek. It's likely that some of the Latin evidence is translated from Greek, and it's perfectly possible that some of the Greek evidence is translated from Latin. It is, however, perfectly possible, indeed it's a requirement to believe, that most of the names of Roman Britain were not formulated in either language, even though they've been transmitted in those forms. The language which is assumed by all respectable scholars, I'll say something about the unrespectable ones in due course, the views of the respectable scholars conclude that the language spoken in Britain at the time was what we now call British Celtic. One of the two major branches of the Celtic languages, the other being essentially Irish, this one, British Celtic, being the ancestor language of Welsh, which is currently quite a lively language, spoken by about a fifth of the population of Wales, though very often unwillingly, if my judgment is anything to go by. Secondly, Cornish, which died out in the 18th century, and the third one being Breton, which is a language that the Bretons continue to propagandize. They believe that it's still a living language, but in the English expression, it's hanging on by the skin of its teeth. In other words, there are few speakers. The number of speakers of Breton is diminishing, and really the only lively language of those three is Welsh, which from time to time I shall make reference to Welsh during the course of the lecture, because that's the most obvious point of comparison with British Celtic, okay, because the British Celtic is the mother language of Welsh. Okay, so what do Reeve and Smith identify as the evidence for their place names? Well, the first category that they invoke is one which I guess most Latinists, most classicists will feel most comfortable with. That is the literature, the classical literature, which mentions Britain. Now, there is a list of authors, leaning from left to right. I'm sure the authors were straighter than that, but the list leans from left to right. The authors' attention to British place names varies immensely. A great number of authors mention only the names of the islands Britain, Britannia, and Ireland, Iwernia, and the Greek equivalents in the case of the Greek authors. Welcome. Very few of the authors on this list actually mention anything about large numbers of names. As I say, Britain and Ireland get mentions. Most authors who bother to mention any others mention the Orcades, which are identified as the islands north of Britain, and only just get onto the map here, the Orkney Islands off the north of Scotland. The other one, which is mentioned by reasonably large numbers of classical authors, is the city of Eburacum, which is York, there on a river in the heart of Yorkshire, which is named after it. Only a very small number mention larger numbers. Julius Caesar mentions quite a number of tribal names. He was obviously the first person who brought back a written report on the names of Britain, which has survived. There were no doubt earlier visitors to Britain, including the Greek sailor Pythias of Marseille, who informed some of the later Greek geographers, but whose personal texts, do not survive. So we have to guess what Pythias actually believed and what he actually wrote, reconstructing that from the work of later geographers like Ptolemy and Strabo. Okay, so very few of these people mention many other names. Gildas, I've put on that list, is of particular importance. In fact, I've colour-coded him because he's so important. Gildas was actually a native of Britain and could speak he may have been a native of Britain. He was probably a native of Britain, although his name is not British. This is the problem. But anyway, Gildas wrote from Britain, wrote within Britain, and is therefore one of the more authoritative. And Bede, known to generations of British schoolboys as the Venerable Bede, no doubt schoolgirls as well, as the Venerable Bede, because of his position, the position accorded to him by later thinkers in the Roman Catholic Church. Bede was an Englishman, there's no doubt, and he is responsible for transmitting some of the later forms of Romano-British place names. So I picked out Gildas and Bede because they were the correspondents on the spot. The other people were reporting from long distances, no doubt in Rome, no doubt in Marseille, no doubt in Narbonne and Athens, for example. Okay, the evidence for place names, sometimes comes from the Greek geographers. Strabo says practically nothing apart from the usual mentions of Britain and Ireland. Procopius says practically nothing. He omits Ireland but talks about Britain and Thule. Thule is a place name which has generated a great deal of excitement over the years because everybody believes that Thule is the place that they're most interested in. So it's been identified with everywhere from the islands next above the Orkney Islands, which are so far north they're not even on the map. Do you mind if I climb up and draw it on the wall? You've got the Shetland Islands, you've got the Faroe Islands, you've got Iceland, you've got Greenland, you have Spitsbergen, Svalbard, and Novaya Zemlya round the corner, if Greek sailors ever got there. So Thule is where you like it to be. Thule actually exists on the map at the moment. This has nothing to do with Romano-British place names except indirectly. Thule is the name of an American Air Force base on Greenland, which is the only place which actually bears the name Thule at the moment. If only Procopius had known. Ptolemy, on the other hand, is a very valuable source of evidence. In modern terms, we would say that his geography, Book 2 of his geography, gives you full georeferenced geographical information on many names. It gives you coordinates which do not map onto latitude and longitude precisely as we know it, so there is latitude in the interpretation of his names. But okay, it's valuable. It's something to go on. It at least enables you to say where place names are relative to each other, even if you can't locate them precisely geographically. Can you hear me at the back, by the way? Is that? Do I need a microphone? Can you hear me? Okay, fine. The next category of place names that Rive and Smith identify are itineraries. Now, itineraries are road maps, essentially, dating from the Roman period. The first one that we know of that survives is the Tabula Poitingerana, which has been dated to the 3rd century, recopied in the earlier 5th century, was then left on a dusty shelf for 800 years or so until someone dragged it out again because it looked sort of interesting. There's then the Antonine Itinerary, which is the most valuable single source because, along with much of the Roman Empire, it covers Britain in very considerable detail. This is its date has occasioned huge controversy, but most people seem to have settled on the 3rd century or so for its origin. Attached to it in some manuscripts is something called the Maritime Itinerary, which is not a road map, as you might have deduced from its name. It tells you how to get from island to island, for our purposes, on the way from Gaul to Britain. So it deals with the Channel Islands, those of them that belong to Britain at the moment. I thought you might like to know what some of these objects actually looked like. So here is Britain in the Tabula Poitingerana. Or rather, in a modern recolouring of one of the manuscripts of the Tabula Poitingerana. What you may notice is that it's the wrong shade. If any of you have any knowledge of Britain at all, you will see that there's a peninsula here which is shoved up there. Scotland has been reduced to That because Scotland's not very important. No, actually, not because it's not very important, but because the Romans never succeeded in subduing Scotland. Okay, successively the Romans built a couple of walls across Scotland. One interpretation of which is to keep the people of Scotland out of what became England, and the other interpretation is to exact taxes from them if they wanted to come from Scotland to England, and possibly in the unlikely case that they wanted to go from England to Scotland. One of the walls features very strongly both in the English psychology and also in the references in classical and subclassical antiquity. It's marked on the map here, in fact. You can see this row of teeth across here, which is Hadrian's wall, the wall ordered by the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD, beginning of the 2nd century AD. This was regarded, if I can borrow a phrase that I've sort of used already, for many people at this time, this was ultima thule. Okay, if you wanted to go beyond the wall, you were insane. But it was tried once because a second emperor built the Antonine Wall a little further north. The Antonine Wall does not figure so largely in the psychology of geography of Britain. First of all, because it's not very prominent, and certainly not as prominent as Hadrian's Wall. And secondly, because if people have written about Roman walls, they've written about Hadrian's Wall rather than the Antonine Wall. So that's the tabula. You'll see, although it's frankly not very clear, that there are roads, and the towns on the tabula are marked by bends in the road. So where there's a vertex like that, there's a town, and if you're lucky, there will be a place name next to it. Okay, so next to this bend here, for example, you will see the town name Ratai, which is Leicester. Okay, the city of Leicester. It's not in the nominative case, but that's a small issue. I'm not going to bother about Latin grammar for the course of the lecture. This is Colchester. It's on the east coast. Well, it is now. But when the tabula was created, it was perhaps not thought to be so close to the east coast as it really is. Some of the others are difficult to make out. This is the River Thames, which flows by Colchester. No, it doesn't. Okay, but it was near enough for the creators of the tabula. Anyway, so that's the tabula. Much more reliable is the Antonine Itinerary, but I couldn't find a nice reproduction of the Antonine Itinerary manuscript. So this is an 18th century envisagement by a very prominent English antiquary of the 18th century called William Stuteley. And you can see, literally, and better than on the tabula, that there are roads. Okay? And the roads are punctuated by place names. The scale is not sufficient to show you really what's going on. But it was the Antonine Itinerary was a proper map of motorway service stations. It told you what the distance was from place to place. It didn't quite tell you whether you could get a cup of coffee at the next one, but it was at least a reasonable guide, whose mileages match on the whole quite well with the real mileages. There's room for dispute, but it's not too bad. And here is a copy of a map from the Ravenna cosmography. I can only say sorry, actually, because it didn't transmit properly. So I can't show you the manuscript of the Ravenna cosmography. But it survives in the best manuscript is believed to be that of the Paris manuscript of the 13th century. Essentially, again, it's just a list of names, but this time without a map. And it's very controversial. Okay, the names as transmitted in Ravennas don't match in many cases with the names that we know from other sources. So Ravenna is always regarded as a second-rate reference and to be ignored if at all possible. At 2 points in this lecture, I shall give you an indication that I think Ravenna is right and that the rest of the evidence is wrong, if I get that far. Okay, well, yes, the Ravenna cosmography was possibly, select whatever qualification you like. It might have been created in the early 8th century and was copied at a number of points in the Middle Ages. We have no idea, frankly, what the cosmographer, the author, was using as his sources. He doesn't appear to have known the Antonine itinerary, the best source, or one that I shall discuss in a minute called the Notitia Dignitatum. It's full of obvious errors of the kind that I've listed there in the next few bullet points. I don't know if you can see. We know for certain, for example, that the city of Winchester in southern England was called Venta Belgarum. We know that because it's confirmed by other sources. It's confirmed phonologically by the modern English name Winchester, which is phonologically accurate for this. We know that the Belgae, a tribe, lived there, and so we're confident that that's what it was really called. If ever you want to hear the word really with inverted commas around it, please do, but I'm going to speak as if it were authoritative. Okay, Ravenna says it was called Venta Velgarum. Okay, where he got the V from, I don't know. Just a bit of carelessness. I've done a V. Let me do another one. And the obviously it's not classical. The genitive plural form is not classical. Yeah. Others, Utriconion, he writes for Viroconium, Durobrabis for Durobrivis, and so forth. You could list the differences ad nauseam. So that's the cosmography. He's basically untrustworthy, and people have often wondered whether the names in his work can be matched with the names in other works, such as the Antonine itinerary. There's a lot of dubious etymologizing of his name. Sometimes his names are taken at face value, and an explanation is given in the literature, and you just wonder, that name doesn't look right to me. I think it's a fake. Perhaps an unintentional fake, but a fake anyway. It doesn't deserve an etymology, and the etymology is going to be misleading. The next piece of evidence that Rive and Smith mention is the Notitia Dignitatum, which is a register of officers, I should say, assigned to named places. So it's basically a military document, a military administration document, probably datable to about 400 AD, which is only 10 years before the Roman forces were withdrawn from what became England, and no doubt the rest of Britain as well. It was revised at various times, but all the manuscripts that survive of it are from the Renaissance, so a good 1,000 years after it was first drafted. So, no thanks. Pretty useless, you would think. The other another category of evidence that they mention comes from inscriptions. Now, inscriptions are a particularly interesting bunch of evidence because of the kind of material that they appear on. First of all, they appear on portable objects. Now, by portable objects, I just mean pieces of kitchenware with attitude. Pieces of kitchenware that are rather more splendid than might appear to be. They're sort of the kind of tourist souvenirs that you can buy at the Tretyakov and so forth, with representations of the pictures on. The ones that they identify are the Rudge cup. I'll show you what it looks like in a moment, and the so-called Amiens skillet, which is often called a patera as well, though in fact the Latin word patera for an object of this kind is far more familiar than the English word skillet. I have no idea what a skillet is, but I know what a patera is. Since Rive and Smith published, there has also been another such item discovered, which is called the Staffordshire Moorlands pan, or if you like, the Staffordshire Moorlands skillet, because it looks rather like the others. Occasionally there are place name inscriptions on coins, but rather more rarely. Now, what's particularly interesting is that this takes us back to the Wall of Hadrian that I mentioned a few slides ago. Okay, there are these cups, bowls, whatever they are, have the names of the forts of Hadrian's Wall inscribed on the rim, which is why I said they're like tourist souvenirs, high quality tourist souvenirs probably. That's the Rudge cup, okay? And if you look closely, you might be able to see, with faith, that it says Camboglanna there, which is the name of one of the wall forts attested in the Antonine itinerary. Okay, so there's a tie-up. If you find a name in two sources, you're on a winner. It's really good stuff. And there's another name, the next fort along the wall is called Banna, and that's, again, it matches with the name in other sources. So the interesting question is, do these names represent the wall, and if so, why? Do they represent the wall forts in the right order? That depends on how you interpret the location of the wall forts, where you think the names belong. But it looks broadly as if they're in the right order, even if a few are missed out. This is the Staffordshire pan, the one discovered only less than 20 years ago. And you can't quite see it because the photographer didn't take it at an angle that suits me. Okay, it actually says Camboglana there, again, like on the other pot. It actually says Camoglana, but hey, what's a B? Friends, we don't bother about it. And there are other names that are known from other sources around there. That's the Staffordshire pan. There is other evidence of inscription on less portable objects. The thing on the left is a transcription by the celebrated historian Collingwood. Shows that it's what it says on a milestone. Okay, I'm sorry to keep jumping up. I'm trying to speak people's way. Here it says Canoio, and Canoium is a place name that we know from other sources as well. So that's useful confirmation, because where the stone was found tells you how many miles. It was 8 miles away from Canoium, this stone. Okay, so where the stone was found, hope it was still in the right place when it was found, and work out where Canoium was. Canoium is British Celtic for probably for the place of reeds or place on the Reedy River. This object on the right is a stone in a church just about 20 miles from where I live, at a place called Caerwent in South Wales. It's of importance from my point of view, not because it actually has a place name on it in this case, but because it gives the name of one of the tribes mentioned in a number of sources. Here in the genitive case you have Silurum, in abbreviated form Civitas, probably in the genitive case, Silurum, the Civitas, however you want to translate that, the polity of the Silures, one of the major tribes. Silures is interesting because it's usually thought to be an uninterpretable name. It doesn't appear to be Celtic, it doesn't appear to be, well, it certainly isn't Latin, and it's certainly not Greek. What the other options are none. Personally, I think it is Celtic, and I can give an explanation, but I've forgotten what I wrote about 10 years ago on that. It involves a rather rare word for fresh and green, something like that. It's a kind of heroic name, suggesting that the tribe were famed as great fighters. That in itself is absolutely fine, because there are a large number of other tribal names which suggest heroic qualities. Whether these are self-designations, whether it's what the people called themselves, or whether it's what other people called them, is a matter of conjecture. So there's a tribe, for example, called the Orgelwikes, which seems to be from the British Celtic word meaning hammer fighters. You don't have to believe that they were differently armed from the rest of the people at the time, but hammer is to be interpreted semi-metaphorically. Anyway, the people of Caerwent think that this is the most important stone in the whole of England, in the whole of Britain. I do beg your pardon. It's a Freudian slip if ever there was one. Okay, so the most important stone in England, and historians tend to agree as well, because it gives information about local military and civil organisation, as well as giving important names. It tells us, for example, that one of the cohorts that were based there were Narbonnensis, in other words, from Narbonne, in what's now in the south of France. That gives a sort of triangulable information. Okay, so the evidence base, as I began the lecture by saying, has not really changed substantially in the last 40 years. A few new inscriptions have been discovered. They very rarely mention tribal or place names. But this is a point of some interest to me. One discovery has led to the correction of one of the names that was thought to be canonically correct. It was taken from Ptolemy, and the name was Coritani, supposedly the name of one of the tribes of the English Midlands. I'm using English in an anachronistic sense, obviously, but what is now the English Midlands. A lead strip discovered in 1990 had CCOREL on it, which didn't relate to anything that was known in the record, except something in the Ravenna cosmography. And I've put in red there on this slide what is found in the Ravenna cosmography, Civitatis Coriel Tauorum. And it was believed that this Coriel Tauorum, implying a tribal name, Coriel Taui, was just another of Ravennas's blunders. Okay? But this strip, this lead strip, even though it's very brief, suggests that the L in the centre of this name was correct, and that Ptolemy was wrong, okay, in this respect. So that's probably, it's now accepted that the name of the tribe in this area was the Coriel Taui. Okay, so Ptolemy put Coritani. It's now read as Coriel Taui, which my former co-author, Andrew Breeze, interpreted as Corio, in British Celtic for host or army, plus an element, a second element, compounded out of the ancestor of the medieval Welsh prefix meaning many, and the name seen in certain British river names. I normally agree with Andrew on things like this, but I think this is totally mad. How can you get what's in effect a tribal name meaning host many river? Does that sound like a tribe to you? No, okay, thank you. Thank you for that support. What I believe it means, I published this, and I don't think it's been challenged since, is that this means Coriae as a genitive case form with a tribal name, Litauorum, in other words, a genitive case form of Litaui, which is a known tribal name, which is also the source of what's the modern Welsh name for Brittany. Okay, Lledau is Welsh for Brittany, and that's an entirely suitable form for that. So I think that the people were probably called, the place was probably called Coria Litauorum, and the people were called Corio Litaui, and I submit that it's not too different from what's that. That's my best guess at the moment. Practically anything that anybody has said about place names in Roman Britain is challengeable. Okay, so I don't intend to be Deus, not even Deus ex machina, on names like this. Let me just go a bit further into the essentially sociolinguistic background that all this implies. What was spoken before the Roman period is pretty speculative. Okay, especially the further back you go. It has been suggested, notably by the European scholar Theo Fenneman, that one of the strands of European place naming was Semitic in character. Okay, and particularly that a Semitic brand of place name came out of the Mediterranean, round the left-hand end of Europe, up the left-hand side of Europe and into the islands. Personally, I think this is not as crazy as it sounds. Okay, and I have published an article. Anything that I mention that I've written, by the way, if people are interested, I'll happily send them copies of this material. But particularly in relation to the island names, the modern island names off Scotland and Ireland, there are a lot of such names that defy explanation, that are unexplained. And what I've suggested in the article that I'm mentioning is that a lot of those names are compatible with derivation from Proto-Northwest Semitic. That is the ancestor language of Phoenician, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Punic, the language of Carthage on the North African coast. I don't want to go so far as to say I believe these names are of Semitic origin. Okay, so please don't transmit any comments you make about this lecture as saying Richard believes that there are Semitic island names. As far as I'm prepared to go, is there are names which are compatible, and because there are a lot of them, that's interesting. There are names that are compatible with derivation from Semitic. Okay, people have been shot for less, I think. So I was quite delighted to be found that to find that a colleague George Broderick from Mannheim University in Germany appears to entertain the same kind of thoughts as well. So, what this implies about historical visitations is quite interesting, and something that I find particularly difficult. Okay, it implies that speakers of Northwest Semitic sailed up the west coast of Europe, just as they sailed down the west coast of Africa. Okay, there's nothing a priori unreasonable about it, but they didn't settle. They simply named islands and transmitted the names back to the people who became Greek and Roman scholars later on. So it's a chain of transmission. But then you might ask, how on earth did the names in such circumstances stay in Scotland and Ireland? How did they leave them there? Which is why I'm very doubtful about putting forward a full-blown hypothesis. But somehow it appears that the Semitic names became known to the locals. In case that sounds crazy, I do have an analogy. Okay, we know where the Vikings settled and where they raided in Britain in the 8th to the 10th centuries. In my part of the world, in Bristol, there are a significant number of minor names around the River Severn that appear to be, and I'm convinced are, of Scandinavian origin, which on the face of it is crazy, because we know the Scandinavians never settled there. Okay? So somehow Scandinavians left behind some island names which were taken up by the English in preference to their own names for these areas, which to my mind is a precise analogy for what I'm suggesting about the possibility of Semitic names on the western coast of the British Isles. Okay, so that's the case that's been made. After the Roman departure, it's much easier, up to a point. It's not that easy. Clearly, Latin had been used and presumably spoken, certainly written and presumably spoken in Britain. We don't know how long it persisted in that guise after the departure of the Roman armies in 410 AD. Okay? And the situation is made cloudy, it's made difficult, by the fact that Latin remained the language of official record and was taken up as the official language by the Anglo-Saxons as well. So by the time the English begin to write, they're apparently still, or again, writing in Latin. So it's probable that Latin persisted, but we have no idea for how long. We know that British Celtic was spoken, the ancestor language of Welsh, largely because the vast majority of the place names are interpretable as British Celtic. Okay? But the situation is made cloudy by the fact that some late changes in British Celtic were rather similar to some changes which were taking place in late Latin and early Romance. I'll say more about those in a moment. So British Celtic persisted and eventually became the languages that I mentioned earlier. In the far west, Welsh, Cornish and Breton. Old English arrived, traditionally speaking, in the year 449. We can't know for certain whether all the English arrived in that year. I'm certain they didn't, but that's when they allegedly started to arrive. And they took over a certain number of place names which they found. Some of those are recognisable from the Romano-British texts. Others are reasonable deductions made by scholars of English about names that are obscure in English. The reasoning goes like this. These are English place names. They don't look as if they were formed in English. So what source might they have had? And the only two straightforward possibilities are either they were British Celtic or they were Latin, okay? Because we know that they were the two languages that were spoken in Britain. Very few turn out to be Latin, though some do. That reduces the field very considerably to just one. If they're obscure, they're probably British Celtic. And so the art, the technique of English philologists is to explain obscure English place names in terms of British Celtic possibilities. And I've devoted a certain amount of my life to doing this. Only time and judgment will tell whether I've wasted my life. Other languages that were spoken in Britain were Old Irish. This comes as a surprise to some people, but we know that there were Irish aristocratic invasions in the period from the 5th century or so onwards, which led to the establishment of small, probably Irish aristocratic kingdoms in the area of what is now Wales. They seem to be of little importance from the point of view of place names. Okay, they don't persist, and they're overtaken by Welsh. The case of Dol Riada, I'm not sure what to call it, a polity, I can't call it a kingdom, I don't know what it was, some kind of political unit on the west coast of Scotland, was established by emigration from Ireland in the 6th to the 7th century. Can I just, for those of you who may be tripped up by this occasionally, I've put the name of by which the Irish language is sometimes known here, Gaelic, but you need to know that it's pronounced Gaelic if it's in Ireland, but it's pronounced Gaelic if it's in Scotland. Okay, so Scottish g is called Gaelic, but Irish g is called Gaelic. Okay, if I say Gaelic from now on, I mean both of them together. Okay, so these are the sociolinguistic assumptions that we make. That the base language, the language spoken by the ordinary population, was the unwritten British Celtic, which I'll call British for short. That's the ancestor of the languages I mentioned earlier. In sources, linguistic sources, you will often find references to Pictish, and also many of the Roman literary sources talk about the Picti, including Julius Caesar, if I remember correctly. This has been very controversial over the years because it's believed that scholars for a certain period in the middle of the 20th century believed that there were two Pictishes, that there was a non-Indo-European Pictish and an Indo-European Pictish which was probably related to British. Okay, that is now it's a view that's being abandoned in favour of the idea that Pictish was a close relative of British, okay, and that they, in part, used some toponymy which may have predated their own usage. In other words, it implies that there were place names that the Picts took over. So if I can say, thank you, under my breath, that maybe some of them were of Semitic origin, that counts for a possibility, though it's not one that I wish to stress. Okay, so some Picts possibly took over a toponymy and an anthroponymy which was not related to British Celtic in any direct way. Clearly, after the successful invasion by the Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, Latin became the language of official administrative usage, especially military usage, and it seems to be the only written language of Roman Britain. Recently, since Reeve and Smith wrote, there have been discovered private letters, discovered in the basement of a Roman fort on Hadrian's Wall. These are called the Windolanda letters. Okay, because Windolanda is the name which is believed to be that of the fort at which they were found. Okay, inscriptions, virtually no inscriptions are known which are not definitely Latin. There are some inscriptions that are pretty obscure, but those that can be interpreted are Latin. You'll sometimes find claims made for other languages of Britain in the Roman period. There is a strand of opinion that grew up in the early part of last decade, in the noughties, in other words, that greater attention ought to be given to the languages of soldiers serving as auxiliaries and eventually as veterans in Britain. Stephen Oppenheimer, in particular, in his book The Origins of the British, claims that Germanic was spoken before the exit of the Roman troops. Now, at one level, that's undoubtedly true, because we know that there were Germanic soldiers who left inscriptions with Germanic names, especially on Hadrian's Wall. The trouble for Oppenheimer's hypothesis is that the inscriptions in which the Germanic names were recorded were in Latin. So it looks as though, for all serious purposes at least, Latin was the language of inscription, and that if Germanic were available, it was just spoken locally in individual units. Now, the trouble is that this idea has been taken up by people who know less about the subject than Oppenheimer does. And I recently came across, in fact only in the last week, a piece on the internet which remains anonymous, but which we should, if you bump into it accidentally, please ignore it. What it does is take some local names that are apparently well understood, they're known to be British Celtic names, and interpret them as if they were Germanic, and more specifically as if they were Old English, Proto-Old English. Just as an example, it takes the name Longowicium, which is a perfectly satisfactorily explainable Celtic name having to do with ships. It translates it as if it were a place called Long Wycombe, an English place name. There is no place called Long Wycombe, but that doesn't matter. The author or authors of this article have the audacity to quote Professor Selivanov correctly as saying that the IUM ending is a correct Latin representation of British Celtic and Greek names in ION, and that's undoubtedly correct. But they say, aha! But what about if it actually represents if the IUM represents the English word ham, which is a place name element? At which point you can safely move to another website, because while purporting to respect the evidence and to quote respectable scholars on the topic, they then introduce something which is absolute nonsense. They go on to explain London as being a place full of long downs, long hills. Now, London is built on small rises out of the marshes, but to call them downs in the same sense that we know the North Downs and the South Downs is excessive, shall we say. And also, in that case, the philology doesn't work. But all I'm saying is beware of the idea, which is not unrespectable in itself, that Germanic languages may have been spoken by auxiliaries in Britain, but beware of any claim that they have left any lasting marks in the landscape. And that's enough of that. So we broadly assume that the settled native population spoke British, that plenty of foreign languages were probably heard locally because of the geographical basis of the units in the Roman army. They probably intercommunicated, these units, in Latin, and would have communicated with the native British in Latin, which implies that some of the native British were bilingual. So there were going to be some, in effect, professional translators who were bilingual. Unfortunately, the linguistic situation is made difficult by the fact that some similar linguistic changes were taking place in Latin and British Celtic at the time, particularly the voicing of plosive consonants, p, t, k, to b, d, g. This was taking place in both Latin and Celtic. And the relation of those two facts to each other is uncertain. And one respectable scholar, the Dutch scholar Peter Schrijver, has claimed that the two languages were influencing each other, perhaps in Britain. I don't happen to believe that, but it's a respectable academic viewpoint. We don't know what triggered the changes in British. Another change was the loss of inflections, which was going on in Celtic and British Celtic and Latin at the same time. But it doesn't look as if they were related to each other, because the source of one of those changes in British Celtic was purely phonological. The endings disappeared, the inflections disappeared, because final syllables disappeared. End of story. Whether they were inflectional or not, the final syllable disappeared. In Latin, though, some final syllables disappeared. Some for example, feminine plurals didn't disappear, but qualitatively, some other syllables remained, disappeared, like, for example, neuter singulars, in many respects, masculine aspects of the masculine nominal declension. Okay, I'd better move on. I've mentioned Peter Schreiber, who's I mentioned in the top point there. Schreiber believes that Britain actually became Latin-speaking and British Celtic was pushed out to the margins, including to Ireland. This is still a controversial opinion, and I have not formed a settled view on it myself. My provisional belief is that I don't believe this is what happened, but that I'm among the other scholars mentioned in the next bullet point. We assume that when the Anglo-Saxon invasions took place, the Anglo-Saxons found a people still conversing mainly in British, because Anglo-Saxon place names, which seem to be of British Celtic origin, show signs of being borrowed in the developed form of British Celtic, the changed later form of British Celtic. So it looks as if British Celtic was still a spoken language at the time the English were taking over place names from them. Place names transmitted in Latin, that is in the forms of the sources which I've already mentioned, show evidence of undergoing British sound changes also, but some of them are ambiguous. So Eburacum, which I've already mentioned, the city of York, turns up in Old English as Eorweek. The week is simply an English word, the word which I'll discuss if I have time in a moment, added to the remains of Eburacum. So the Eorvor is the Ebur of the Roman period place name. It's from a Celtic plant name which has been analysed as either meaning yew, that's Y-E-U, the yew tree, or a more herbal plant of the parsnip type. How the same word in Celtic appears to attach to two such completely different plants, I don't propose to suggest. I have no idea. York, surprisingly, if you're unaware of these things, is actually the remains of Eorweek. It's the reduced version, the reductions of which were caused by Viking interventions, because Jorvik becomes the Viking name for York, and it gets scrunched down to York, the single syllable York. Some of those other names, like Abona, is simply the Celtic name, the British Celtic word for river. It survives in the Welsh word Avon, which is still today the word for river, but it's not a river name. You don't find a river Avon, an Avon anywhere in Wales. And it looks as if the incoming English, and perhaps the Romans before them, simply asked the locals what this flowing thing was called, and they replied, Abona. And this was because sometimes they actually gave a river name, like Sabrina. The unwary Romans or the unwary English took this as being the name of the river, with the result that there are 5 river Avons in England. We're on more interesting. The in the modern English could, in theory, be a response either to British Celtic sound changes or to the sound changes that were taking place in late Latin at this period, part of the lenition between vowels. But what tells us definitely that some place names were transmitted in their Celtic form is exemplified by the last 2 names. Danum is the name of a river in Yorkshire, which gives its name to the modern town of Doncaster. The Castra bit is, you don't have to be very far on in Latin to recognise it as Castra. There's a story behind it, but that's for another day. But if this had been borrowed into English, it would have almost certainly been pronounced Down. But because it's Don, it clearly comes from the British Celtic Down, which is the general proper form which the river name would have taken in British Celtic. Even more strikingly, the name of the river Trent, the large river flowing through central England, is recorded as Trisantona in the earliest evidence. The fact that the S has disappeared is significant because S's in this position disappear in British Celtic, they do not disappear in Latin. So this is clear evidence that the name was taken over in its Celtic form rather than in its Latin form, proving that at least at the point before the English slew the Celts, if that's what they did, they were borrowing place names from them. Right, so the question of how many Anglo-Saxons came to Britain, what they did to the British, is controversial. The standard view, the old-fashioned view, is that the Anglo-Saxons arrived in large numbers and expelled, enslaved or exterminated the British, the 3 E's. Okay? The evidence for that is that very few lexical borrowings from British into English have been identified, though I should say that my colleague Andrew Breeze, that I mentioned earlier, has done very good work in identifying a much larger number of words which survived from Celtic into dialects of English, but did not survive into Middle English. Okay? So it's clear that a significant number of words, a significantly larger number of words than the general belief, survived into English, but that number itself is still rather small. Okay? So more than we thought survived into English, but still not very large numbers. Okay, whatever the case of that, it appears that the Britons were culturally silenced, especially in southeast England, where there are very few place names of British origin. There are in the county of Sussex, for example, which I lived in the county of Sussex for 30 years and studied its toponymy quite closely. There are no surviving place names in the narrow sense, that is, names of inhabited places, which can convincingly be argued to be of British Celtic origin. A couple of the rivers, perhaps, and one name for the Great Forest, the forest of Andredeswald, might have a British Celtic origin, but that name dropped out of use, and it's no longer used in Middle English. So, Celtic speakers were disposed of somehow. As I say, the standard theory is that large numbers of the English arrived and did the 3 E's to the British Celts. My view is that probably small numbers of English arrived and did precisely the same. So that being a military aristocracy, they were able somehow to render the British culturally silent, with the result that in a relatively short time, British Celtic ceased to be spoken. Though there is equivocal evidence that the British were regarded as a separate race according to the laws of several kings. Okay, and it's difficult to know what to make of this because, of course, just because the law says you are a Briton, it doesn't mean that you spoke British Celtic. You could have been identifiably, ethnically Welsh, let's say, without speaking the ancestor of Welsh. It seems to be very clear that in most of England very little British was spoken, though pockets remain. The Welsh would be insulted to be called a pocket, but let's say that Wales and Cornwall are among the pockets where British Celtic survived. Probably Herefordshire, which a lot of which was Welsh-speaking until the Middle Ages and indeed later. Possibly the Lake District, probably the Lake District. And a district which has been of interest to me recently is a patch in the northwestern corner of the southern county of Wiltshire, which appears to have a remarkably large number of British surviving names, including 13 examples of the field name Idover, which seems to be lower on the river in British Celtic. So make of that what you will. I was intrigued. Okay, how much time do I have left, Professor Selivanov?
I think we have still maybe 10 minutes if we will provide discussion.
Okay, will you grant me 10 more minutes? Mm-hmm. I'm in your hands. Right, okay. Let me just decide how to cut down. Okay. How did I do that? That's quite drastic. Let me. I'm going to miss out the bit about Britain and Ireland because that's well covered in the literature, and I can give you literary references to that. The Romano-British toponymy which we have on the evidence available is, for obvious reasons, mainly grammatically Latin. The nominative and some combination of dative, ablative and instrumental cases are evidenced. Some names are formally in Greek, mainly in Ptolemy. They may be translated from the Latin, or maybe sometimes from British. There's a complication in that the British Celtic neuter singular ends in on, which is precisely the case in Greek as well. So if we find this in a Greek source, we don't know if it's taken from British Celtic or whether it's a Hellenization of the name. There's no direct evidence for British Celtic names. We only have the names in this mainly Latinized guise. Nevertheless, we can be pretty confident that, if you don't believe me already, it's fine. I've softened you up to the belief that British Celtic was the general language of Britain at the time, but this is the proof. We have names which are fully interpretable in British Celtic. For example, certain names of the tribes. Okay, tribes were known, for example, as the Catuelauni, which is fully identifiable as in the light of Welsh words meaning battle and excellent, and the combination of them, battle excellent, is perfect for the kind of name that societies in the heroic age, whether Germanic or Celtic, were giving to themselves, or that others were giving them. It's absolutely perfect. Brigantes clearly relates to the Celtic word for high, which survives in Welsh words for height and hill, and the Dumnonii, who lived in the southwest of what's now England, were clearly named from a word which survives in Welsh as dwfn, meaning deep, or in some ways mysterious, or to do with the underworld. So these are solid evidence that the tribes were known by Celtic names. The place names of Roman Britain as transmitted in the evidence that I spent time discussing at the beginning of the lecture are often fully interpretable in British Celtic if you ignore the ending, which is of course Latin. So Lindum, the name of the city of Lincoln, is from a British Celtic name, Lindon, where the lind bit survives as Welsh llyn, which means a pool. Even more strikingly, Blatobulgium does not survive as a place name in English, but it does in Scots. So there are places in Scotland called Blebo, for example, which can be etymologized in this way. It means flour sack. And one of the places which has been identified as Blatobulgium archaeologically is the site of a large Roman period military granary, a place for storing grain. I don't need to make the case, do I? It's obvious that this is an accurate description in British Celtic of the nature of the place. Windocladia is British Celtic for white dyke. Dyke, in this sense, I'm using in an archaeologically technical sense, for a dug ditch where what is dug out of the ditch is used to make a rampart. So it's a wall and a ditch. Okay, so Windocladia is a known site. It means the White Dyke. This particular hill fort was built the end of Roman Britain.
Sorry for the fall of Britain.
The solution which you're seeing is the solution which the Roman Empire tried to impose. Put the empire together with sellotape at the end. Okay, so Windocladia means white dykes, and the particular place is cut on the chalk, the white rock of southern England. Okay, and Moridunum is a known site again. It's the town of Carmarthen in southern Wales. It's from British Celtic for sea fort, or actually perhaps from, it's the Latin mare rather than the Celtic more, but either way it's formed as a British Celtic name, using Latin or not, and it means sea fort, which is nicely at the top of an estuary leading out into what's now the Bristol Channel in the south of Britain. So these names suggest beyond dispute that British Celtic was being spoken at the time Roman place names were being formed. We do get some Latin place names, which are in some ways of philological interest, in some quite detailed, interesting ways, which in some cases prove that they were being spoken by British Celts, rather than by classical Latin speakers. I'm not sure whether you can see those. There's a place in southern England in one of the itineraries called Spinis. If your Latin stretches very far at all, you will know that this is Latin for at the thorn bushes. Okay, it's a perfectly good Latin name. The name actually survives, very surprisingly, in modern English. The place still exists and it's called Speen. This is a surprise because if the Latin name had gone through the normal English sound changes, the name of the place would have been Spine. Okay, so why is it called Speen? Is it that British Celtic speakers survived until the 18th century or thereabouts in secret conclave with Freemasons to continue the Latin name? No, the answer is that it proves that British Celtic was spoken, because a late British Celtic change lowers the vowel E to the vowel A. So forgetting the dissonance, forgetting the inflectional ending, the place would have been known as Spain in late British. And if that had persisted, it would have been known in Welsh as Spuin. But if it were Spain in the ancestor language of Welsh, this would have come to be Speen in modern English. And if your memory is any good, you'll recall that that's precisely what the modern English name is. So in a rather odd sort of way, the existence of this Latin place name in a transparent form, surviving in modern English, proves that British Celtic was the language in which it was transmitted. Fanfare. Okay, other Latin names are known from some of the types of evidence that I mentioned before. There are two places called Salinae, Salinae, the salt works. Both of these were famous through into medieval English. They are the places called Droitwich, which is from the Old English for the royal place of industry. I'll say a little bit more about Weech in a moment if I can. The other place was called Nantwich, which is from the Old English for the famous Weech. Okay, so I said they were famous, and the Anglo-Saxons agreed. So Salinae may not have been a place name, of course, because it doesn't survive in either of those two places. It may just have been a place description. What we do not necessarily know from the records is whether things like Salinae are place names or place descriptions. Okay? In the case of Speen, it's pretty clear that it was a place name. In the case of Salinae, it's less clear. Pontibus, at the bridges, in Latin. What do we know about this? Could it have been a Celtic name? We know that the Welsh for bridge is pont. Okay? But the Welsh didn't have bridges as we know them. They had what we call pontoons, which were described by the Celtic word briwai, okay, briw, in its early Welsh form. So pontibus may have been a translation of the Welsh word, or it may just genuinely be a Latin term. This place was at the bridges. It survives in English in a possibly translated form. It's the town of Staines, to the west of London. Okay, Staines means the stones, in an extremely dubious piece of phonology. We don't know why it's called Staines, not Stones, and a different story needs to be told. I've got nothing clever to say about that. But if you can imagine that it was a stone bridge, and that's why the Welsh called it a pont, okay, because it was different from the rather rickety bridges that they themselves built. If it was a stone bridge, that might explain why it or its remnants were described in English as the stones. Calcarea is clearly Latin for the chalk quarries. We only know this because Bede, the Venerable Bede, mentions it in one of his works. He gives it the English name Calcacaster. Okay, Calcacaster. We believe that this refers to Calcarea. It's the only English evidence for the survival of Calcarea. We know where it was. It's at a place in Yorkshire now called Tadcaster, where there were quarries of the appropriate kind. Okay, there are others that we can't say very much about. Like ad ansam appears in an itinerary. It's clearly Latin for at the loop in the river, at the bend in the river, presumably. We can work out where it probably was, but was it ever a place name, or was it just the name of a motorway service station, as it were, in East Anglia? There is evidence which supports my position that Celtic was the general spoken language, because some Latin terms are taken into place names in a Celtic structure and then transmitted in Latin. Okay? If you want the model for that, it's the second bullet point in the last three. So you get things like, I'm going to pronounce it as if it were Latin, rather than get complicated about how the Celts pronounced it. Okay? So this is a Caesaromagus, where Caesar is clearly Caesar. It was named after Caesar. The O is the typical British Celtic linking element, and the mag bit is the what became the Welsh general word for a place, or particularly a marketplace, magos, which is then given a Latin ending for the purposes of transmission in an itinerary. So Caesaromagus is a heavily Latinized but evidently Celtic name, Celtic by structure. Okay, I think the evidence suggests there that clearly we are talking about surviving British Celtic rather than about a Latin place name. Okay, perhaps just one from this slide, because I know time is running short. This is a favourite of mine because I thought of it. This is a piece of vanity on my part, if you like. The Welsh word for England is a puzzle to most English speakers. The Welsh word for England is Lloegr. Okay, and this has defied analysis until fairly recently. Okay, it doesn't appear to be Celtic unless you make some difficult argument about its phonology, which doesn't quite stack up. The Celtic scholar Ranko Matasovic fairly recently suggested that it was from a collective noun, a Celtic collective noun, laikor, which he's invented. It's not actually attested in any of the Celtic languages. A collective noun meaning warriors, based on an identifiable Celtic word for a warrior. So were the English coming in viewed as the warriors? And my answer is yes, but I think Matasovic was wrong. Okay? Yes, I think it does mean the warriors, but I think it's actually a Germanic borrowing, because West Germanic laikaros, which resembles the hypothetical Celtic in a very striking way, and also meant warriors, is actually attested in at least one of the Germanic languages. It appears in Old Norse in a somewhat similar guise, not in precisely this guise, but in a phonologically regular, developed form. And laikaros, for various phonological reasons, perfectly explains Lloegr. So because of the sound changes that we know that intervened between British Celtic and Welsh. So that's my contribution to the discussion, and even if it's about England rather than about Wales. Some of the others you might like to know. I'll mention one of the persons. Boudica is the most famous Welsh woman of all time, even though she preceded the establishment of Wales. Boudica was the Icenian chieftainess, who rebelled against the Romans in the 1st century AD, and was slain in battle for her pains. Her name is simply Welsh for victorious. Okay, it gives us the Welsh word byddig, which still means victorious. Okay, the trouble is that her name appears in a number of very difficult forms. She's normally known, or until recently was known in English as Boadicea, and Boadicea, which is clearly based on a very bad manuscript of Tacitus, because he almost certainly wrote Boudica with 2 C's rather than a C and an A, because that's nearer the original form. But that was wrong in itself, because that would mean that her name was Byddich in modern Welsh, but it isn't, it's Byddig. So her correct Welsh name, according to the word surviving in Welsh, was as I've spelt it on the slide there, Boudica. Okay, the others, I've drawn attention to some works that I've put about recently, possible Celtic explanations for other characters in early British history, which you can take or leave. I'm not certain about any of them. Okay, so I could stop at that point, and perhaps I could simply say, to relate it to things that I've mentioned earlier in the talk, that the name of Cirencester, a town in Gloucestershire, one of the most important towns of Roman Britain, is transmitted as Corinium, and only in Ptolemy, in that form. Okay? It seems to me that this leaves difficulties, because the place wouldn't be called Cirencester in modern English if it had been Corinium. It would have been something like Kernchester, which it isn't. Okay, so why does it come to be called Cirencester? The answer can be dealt with simply by looking at Ptolemy's form in the top left-hand corner and changing the O and the first I around, giving you Chironium. If you have Chironium, that explains, for English phonological reasons, precisely the name Cirencester as transmitted in Norman French. No difficulty at all. There is not even a shred of phonological difficulty about it. The only difficulty is that Ptolemy said it was Corinium rather than Chironium. But the fact is that the Ravenna cosmography actually has the form Chironium in it. And this has generally, universally been treated as further evidence for what a fool the cosmographer was. He's got it wrong again. It's just one of those many errors that he makes. But I think it stands up that this time he got it right. And that Ptolemy was probably influenced by obvious names like Corinthos to switching the vowels round. Being, after all, a Greek, he would have been susceptible to the influence of Greek place names, such as that of Corinth. Okay, so it's one of the few cases where the source is perhaps more trustworthy than we've given him attention before. The last one I want to talk about, this is, honestly, I'll stop at this point, is a very, very obscure place in English Midlands called Magiovinium. It's a place which is now called Dropshort Farm. Let me assure you from the start that Dropshort is not the regular phonological evolution of Magiovinium, but it looks like the Ion is the standard, one of the standard place name endings again, but the first part of the name can genuinely be explained better by a Germanic given name than by any Celtic explanation. It's possible to give a Celtic explanation, but only if you treat the name with a lack of caution that it deserves. If you think that this is from the Germanic name Magawinis, kinsman friend, which is a perfectly good Germanic name because it turns up in Old English, and believe that this Germanic-speaking person was sufficiently important to hold property in central Britain in the 2nd or 3rd century AD, perhaps as a retired auxiliary, then you can treat this as Maiwina's place. And this is a suggestion that I've made. It's not uncontroversial because you can give a Celtic explanation, but the Celtic explanation is, in my view, slightly more difficult. In particular, because the VIN bit actually has no ready explanation within Celtic. So you have to invent a word to explain the origin of the place name. Okay, that's it. I could talk very briefly about the word augurium, which I think is Latin for miracle, or that's one of its possible interpretations. It seems to have been taken up into British Celtic in a very specific sense, that it's the name of a tidal phenomenon on the two great English rivers, the Severn and the Trent. It's where the river appears to flow backwards. And the usual word for this on the River Severn is the Severn Bore. If you want to know what the Severn Bore looks like, there it is. That's the river going backwards. The river flows that way. Okay, but at a certain stage of the tides, the force of the tide coming up the estuary is stronger than the force of the river flowing down the estuary. So the river appears to flow backwards. You don't have to be very primitive to think that this is surprising and wonderful, okay, when the river flows backwards. I've seen it in person. It's amazing. Okay. So I believe that it was known to the British of the area as in one of the vulgar Latin forms of the word augurium. My testimony for that is the phonologically regular name of the village, or AWRE, on the banks of the River Severn, precisely where the tide becomes strongest, where the bore becomes strongest. On the River Severn, on the River Trent, there is a similar phenomenon which is known as the eagre, the E-A-G-R-E, which is an entirely regular phonological development of augurium. So I suggest that although in different guises, in the one case Latin, in the other case early Welsh, the word augurium for a miracle appears in words which are not quite English place names, but which describe English places very effectively. There's the bore. These days the bore has a modern format. People surfboard on the bore, which reduces its naturalness and its effectiveness to a great extent. But there they are on the bore. And you've seen this one before, so thank you for listening anyway. I apologise for talking for so long. But
thank you for such inspiring lecture, and I suppose there will be some a place for some questions. Будут ли вопросы какие-нибудь у аудитории? Before someone thinks, my own question, which tortures me for quite a lot of time.
Oh dear.
In Windowland, the first part is windows, which must be white.
It appears to be, yes.
But what
right.
is the second part?
The usual interpretation, unless you are one of these modern anglicising scholars, the usual interpretation is that it's from a Celtic word landa, which means a space of some description, usually an open space. It may be cognate with the word land, in fact.
In French sense,
Le land in French would contain the same word. It's also the origin of the Welsh word llan, which is L-L-A-N, which is one of the most frequent Welsh place name elements. It's usually translated in modern times as church, because it's compounded with, in many cases, with a saint's name. But what it usually means is not so much a church as the space on which that church was built. So holy ground, consecrated ground in some way, an enclosure dedicated to the saint. The normal word in Welsh for church is eglwys, but llan, if you're talking casually to English people, Welsh people will say it's church, okay, just to get the English people off their backs. So yes, I think Windowland is the white open space. Whatever les landes are, it refers to that.
Maybe holy open space.
There are metaphorical possibilities for the word white. Certainly in Welsh hagiography, gwyn, meaning either white or fair, is often given as a nickname for a saint. Okay, so if someone is called, David Gwyn, or something like David Wyn, David the White, it can be interpreted and is interpreted by some as meaning David the Sacred, David the Holy, something like that. There's room to wonder whether it's true, but it's certainly possible.
Thank you. More questions?
Rather a marginal than a question. This summer on Tornsky readings in St. Petersburg, we have a brilliant talk. I don't remember the name. It was handsome young man. Well, he was speaking about the landmarks related to the name of Alexander the Great. We take any medieval map, we have any medieval itinerary, and whatever place it be, extreme points were marked with names of Alexander, not with his real landmarks. For example, there are historically justified places where Alexander the Great made his camp or so on, but there are also mythological points invented by the map makers. So I just wonder whether you could trace any names related to Alexander the Great on maps. I don't mean the historical maps of Middle Age, but are there any traces of landmarks related to Alexander the Great?
Is the Alexander myth in Britain?
Yes.
Alexander becomes part of English mythology only in the Middle Ages. There is nothing before 1066, certainly, and when the Chanson de Geste starts to become. There are occasional mentions in Old English of Alexander, but it's always the person, not the place name. He becomes very popular because of the medieval myths, which is why Alexander is very frequent as a given name fairly frequent as a given name in medieval English, and continues to be, but has also been taken up in Scottish. The form Alistair is Alexander in Scottish Gaelic, not Gaelic, remember, Scottish Gaelic. And Alistair is now a very common name in England as well. So spelt in different ways, but you get many English children of 1 to 2 generations back called Alistair.
But nothing in topography?
Nothing no topographical names at all. I'm absolutely confident. Okay. You can throw water on me if you say that I'm wrong.
We will not. Some more questions?
Hello.
Thank you very much for your report. It was very interesting. So, my question: you have noticed a place Pontibus, which was translated, as I understood, from Celtic, British Celtic, to Latin.
I wonder. Yes.
Yes. So my question: if there were other places which were not just transmitted from Latin, from Celtic Britain to Latin, but they were translated directly. I just can give an example. For example, the region Kilikia in Asia Minor, there are some places which were firstly translated, for example, from Sumerian to Ancient Greek, then from Ancient Greek to Arabic maybe, and then from Arabic to Turkish. And there are lots of such places. So I'm interested if there are more examples for such translation from British Celtic to Latin in Britain.
Okay, that's an extremely interesting question, which I think raises general principles. Again, the general principles is how frequent translation is in toponymy, which may be a cultural variable. The situation in Cilicia you've described suggests that it was normal for a place name to be understood, a place name's etymology to be understood and to be translated. If you have a field like this, it's actually impossible to say whether translation has taken place. You would have thought that a name like Lindum, the pool in British Celtic, would be ripe for translation. The Romans would arrive. I know Lincoln very well. There is a very conspicuous pool in Lincoln, known now not as the pool but as Brayford Water. But you would have thought that that speakers of Latin would have called it the pond or the pool if they were, since the opportunity faced them. But no, they took over what the British Celts called it. That suggests a cultural attitude towards translation of place names at the negative end of the scale, that on the whole they took over a place name rather than translating it. My point about Staines here, Pontibus, was rather not so much did it translate a Celtic name, but did the local British use the Latin word for something that they didn't have. In other words, a structured stone bridge rather than something more feeble. So I'd say that isn't evidence for translation from British Celtic. It's pretty unclear. It's pretty clear that they borrowed the word pont, because here you have Tripontium, which is structurally Celtic and appears to mean the 3 bridges. Okay. You could argue that it was Latin as well, but it's more clearly Celtic than it is Latin. You would have to do some phonological argumentation to make it Latin, but it's certainly, just as it stands, apart from the ending, of course, a good Celtic name. So my basic position is that translation is unlikely, but you can never say that it never happened. Okay? Clearly, in Cilicia, things were very different, and there was a basic assumption that it would happen. Yeah? Here again, dunum, which is it's based on the Celtic word. It's generally believed to be from the Celtic word for a hill fort, but clearly the Roman invaders didn't call it a hill fort. They called it what the British called it. Yeah? Even though it's a simple term, just the single word dunum, which was probably borrowed into English to give our word down in the sense of a hill as well. Though there are phonological difficulties with that. There's phonological difficulties with practically everything if you probe deeply enough. But there is nothing there for which I could be absolutely certain that there is translation. Mediolanum, the middle of the plain. Okay, pure Celtic, and of course it's exactly the Latin name for the city of Milan in Italy as well. This is not a flying city. It was clearly a different place, but formed in an entirely Celtic manner. The middle of the plain, and of course the obvious fact that needs to be mentioned is that what's now northern Italy was a Celtic-speaking area at the relevant time, continental Celtic. So no great surprises.
Lanum in Mediolanum is that land which becomes a clan.
You would expect it to be Mediolandum if that were the case. I think lan is a different word that gives llawn rather than llan. It's probably a long vowel in other words rather than short one. But all the simple terms are in Celtic. Ratai, the ramparts. Okay. Danum's directly from the name of the river. Petuaria, the quarter, the foursome, the place where four unidentifiable things could be discovered. Yeah. The four.
In which case is Pontibus?
Well, Pontibus, I suspect, is a name simply given in Latin. Or by the Celts while they were speaking Latin, which might amount to the same thing. Yeah. But it's clearly a Latin name. The word itself, pont, as I say, is borrowed from Latin into Welsh.
Some kind of Brexit. Can we have more
I'm afraid in which case the Britons could not suffer the second.
I reckon that we could
It was, after all, an Englishman that wrote The Fall of the Roman Empire.
Я хотел только в заключение сказать, что профессор Коутс выступает по приглашению не только кафедры классической филологии, но и Московского государственного педагогического университета. И мы рады видеть представителей педагогического университета Владислава Викторовича Алпатова и коллег. Вот, ну что же, я думаю, что тогда мы просто среди нас есть первокурсники, для которых это может быть некоторый такой новый вид погружения, и просто из человеколюбия мы поэтому, пожалуй, на этом закончим.
There are a lot of first-year students here, so for mercy.
To first-year students, I apologise.
Yes, only for humanity's sake.
Yes, okay.
Thank you very much.
If you are first-year students, I hope I haven't put too many of you off the study of